In this lesson, we'll understand bodies and components. After completing this lesson, you'll be able to identify bodies and components in Fusion 360, explain the benefits of using components in a design, and explain what functionality requires the use of components. To get started in Fusion 360, we want to make sure that we have our utility knife upload file open, but we also want to upload a few more files. We're going to be taking a look at the file createcomponents.f3d, as well as uploading the file utilityknife-bodies. We can control select both of these and then select upload. Once both of these designs are uploaded, make sure that you have both open. Simply double click on utility knife-bodies and double click on create components. First, let's focus on the utility knife upload. We want to take a look at a handful of things. First, we want to take a look in the browser. The browser has several folders, including origin, joints, canvases, sketches, and construction. Also below this, we have what are called components. 4 of the components have a pin icon, meaning they are fixed inside of the canvas. 2 of them, the blade and the blade cradle, do not. If we expand our joints folder, we have a rigid joint, which will be between the blade and the blade cradle, and then we have a slider joint. This allows the blade and the blade cradle to move forward and backward. The joints can be applied between components in a single body or between components and other components. They can be found on the Assemble menu, and there are 2 different varieties. Joint, which allows you to select components and their position, and as-built joint, which makes use of the current location. There are some other tools in here that we'll explore later on. Next, let's take a look at the utility knife-bodies. You note in this one, we still have canvases, sketches, and construction. However, we don't have all the components listed below it. And if we try to grab onto the blade, nothing moves. If we expand the bodies folder, you'll note that the icon is slightly different. While we have a cylinder here, the icon for a component is going to be a cube. As we take a look at these, this file was designed as bodies, but you'll also note that there's no history in the timeline. There's a base feature and a form that was used to create the main body, but nothing else has a feature. However, when we look at the utility knife upload, we can see all the features that were used to create the various different pieces of geometry in the design. Next, let's take a look at our file Create Components. In this design, we have a sketch that contains 2 closed rectangles. We're going to take a look at the ways in which we can create bodies and components, and then we'll go back to our utility knife bodies file. From here, we're going to start by selecting Extrude. We're going to select one of the profiles, begin to drag it up, and the distance doesn't matter in this case, and note that the operation has New Body by default. If we use this drop-down, notice that there's an option for New Component. So let's go ahead and select New Body. We'll show the sketch again, select Extrude again, and then select the other profile. Drag this one up, and this time change the operation to New Component. Notice inside of our browser, the original body, Body 1, is inside the Bodies folder, while Component 1 has its own drop-down, its own origin, and its own bodies folder. While both of these are called Body 1, this is just a placeholder name. I'm going to rename Body 1 to Extrude Comp for Extrude Component. I'm going to rename the Body 1 to Extrude Body. So we've used the same sketch from the same sketches folder in order to create an extrude body and an extruded component. When we take a look at the component, there's a radio button next to it to activate it. When we do this, we can see all the features that are created as part of that component. In this case, we have component 1, which was created from an extrude. The sketch is not included in here because the sketch was created before the component. Let's take a look at this one more time. Let's get started by going to our Assemble menu and select New Component. By default, whichever component is active is going to be the parent, and we're going to create a new component and we're going to rename it New Comp. We'll allow it to activate and we'll say OK. Now let's start a new sketch. We'll pick a plane. We'll use a sketch rectangle of any size, don't worry about dimensions, and then we'll finish the sketch. From here, we'll select Extrude, we'll drag it up, and we'll allow it to create a new body. The reason we want to create a new body is because we're currently inside of a component. We can say OK, and now if we expand our new component, we have a Bodies and a Sketches folder. Body 1 is created inside of here, and the sketch that was used for it is also inside of our component. Notice that in the timeline, we have a sketch and a feature. And if we go back to the top, you can see that sketch and feature, as well as the creation of the component. These three items together are going to represent the new component that we just created. So there's a little bit of a nuance that we need to understand, because bodies and components are not always a clear distinction when we're talking about beginning the modeling process. In general, rule number 1 when creating a new design is to start by creating an empty component. When we create an empty component, we then can contain all of the sketches and features that are used inside of it, inside of that component, which makes it very easy for us to activate and identify specific features. We can always see all of the features at the top level, and if we select, in this case, a geometry, you can see exactly the component as well as the feature that was used to create that face. It also is going to highlight the component in the browser if we need to. In this case, new component, bodies, and body 1. So there are many different ways which we can organize our designs by creating these new components. It's also important to note that if our plan is to have mechanical motion, in this case of the utility knife, allowing the blade to slide back and forth. For more advanced mechanical designs, having relationships between gears or having contact sets requires the use of components. Another place components are important is when we get to detailed drawings. Components are going to make up the parts lists, and the way that you organize your design is going to have an effect downstream for those detailed designs, especially when we talk about creating exploded views, as components can be moved and exploded, but bodies cannot. Let's take a look at the utility knife-bodies file, and let's talk about ways in which we can turn this into a file that has components. So if we select all of the components from left housing down to blade cradle, I can right-click, and I can select Create Components from Bodies. This will automatically turn each of these into a component. The component will contain its own bodies folder, and it will contain its own body. Now that these are components, they are free to move about inside of the canvas, so you'll notice that everything can now move. I'm going to revert the position, and I'm going to temporarily hide the blade and blade cradle. I'm going to right-click on the left housing and ground it. Then I'm going to go to Assemble, and I'm going to create what's called a rigid group. A rigid group will allow me to select other components such as the grip, the right housing, and the other grip, and then turn them into a rigid group of components. Now, none of these other components can move because the left housing is fixed. If I unground it, then they'll all move together as one piece. However, the blade and the blade cradle are still in the original position. Let's go ahead and revert. Let's select the unground feature in the timeline, right-click, and delete it. We're not going to go through the entire process of applying joints, but just note that having components in a design is going to be a critical step in creating mechanical motion, but it also helps in organizing our designs. From here, let's go ahead and save all the designs that we've been working on. So simply select each one, select File and Save, or simply select Save from the File menu. Also note that shortcut keys such as Ctrl and S will also work for saving your designs. From here, once everything is saved, go ahead and move on to the next step.